Now, after Israel attempted to wipe out Hamas's negotiating team in Qatar, which is a key US ally with a big US military base, a lot of people just looked at that and thought, well, this is completely deranged now. I mean, it already looked completely deranged. Obviously, Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. But, you know, a lot of people just saw this as, I guess, just totally drunk on impunity. You know, a rogue state like no other in history, because it's just acting as though no rules or laws apply to it, whatever we think about international law. What the hell is going on? Where's this all going to lead? Well, no better person to speak to than David Waring, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Sussex, a true expert on Britain's role in the Middle East, and just an expert in the Middle East. Currently writing a book on Britain's involvement in the war in Yemen, which is something which was dramatically underreported over the years by the Western media. How are you doing?
Not bad, mate. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Kafir. I can't wear mine. We were talking about this before. I thought it'd be overload because I've just come back from Palestine. I've got a video coming out about that shortly. But it is great to see. I think you're looking. You wear it well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's just start. I think. I mean, when. I think it is. I do actually tell myself every day, never stop being shocked. I think it's important. You know, not just to go, well, what do you expect? This is what they're like. Yeah, I think being shocked is quite important, actually, not normalizing things. When they attacked Qatar and tried to wipe out Hamas's negotiating team, failed, but killed several other people, and attacked the sovereign territory of another country unambiguously just against international law. And also, it's really basic principle. You don't try and wipe out other people's diplomats. There's actually not really any precedent for that, or very little precedent in human history. What's your take on it? Let's start with Qatar. What's your take on it?
I mean, the huge difference here, I think, is that, you know, Israel, we're used to Israel taking military action beyond its borders, obviously, particularly in the last couple of years, where it's just struck everywhere: Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, even before we mentioned Gaza and West Bank. But what's different here is that everywhere else where it's struck up till now, you've had the governments that preside over those territories, or the authorities that preside over those territories, are geopolitical opponents of Israel and the wider West as well. So the Iranian regime, with Lebanon, it's complex, but fundamentally we're thinking about Hezbollah, whether or not the government, a powerful actor. Syria, it's been first the Assad regime and then this new revolutionary regime, which Israel probably sees as hostile. The Houthis in Yemen, and obviously Hamas in Gaza. Qatar is not a geopolitical adversary of the West, to put it extremely mildly. I mean, Qatar is such an important, significant part of the structure laid down by Western imperialism in the Middle East, and it's an absolutely key ally of Western power. I don't know how much detail we've got time to go into it, but just to give like a brief bit of historical depth to it. The regime in Qatar has been an ally of the West probably for, 150 years, something like that. I haven't been the exact date on it. I mean, it was a protectorate of the British through the 19th century. I think that was formalised in the early 20th century, but the British were the main colonial power in the Persian Gulf in the 19th century. It gains independence from the British in the early 70s, and almost immediately becomes an American protectorate. So the links go back a long, long way. It's in the energy heartlands of the planet. The Persian Gulf is where a huge amount of the world's readily accessible oil is. Qatar itself sits atop this enormous gas field. So not only is it a close ally, but it's a really geopolitically important ally because of where it sits in the energy producing system. And it's a military ally in the sense that, you know, the US's major base, the kind of key hub for how the US projects military power into the region, is in Qatar. This airbase, out-of-date airbase, 10,000 US personnel there. And And it's obviously it's this diplomatic hub as well, and it's got its own geostrategic kind of approach, which is to try, be a hub for diplomacy and culture, etc., etc. But just to go back to the absolutely key point here, it's an ally of the West. It's a long-standing ally of the West. It's a super, super important ally of the West, economically in terms of energy and in terms of sort of military ties as well. For the Israelis to hit any US ally, any Western ally, would be something. To hit Qatar is incredible. And just to briefly emphasize this, if I haven't laboured the point too much already, the area that they struck, the residential area in Doha that they struck, is a 40-minute drive from the El Udeid Air Base. It's a short drive from that residential area where lots of the internationals live. Some of my friends live there, to the American military base. So it's stunning that they would do this. It's a huge step. Every few months in this war, there's another escalatory step. Another norm broken, another rule broken. Israel really pushing at the bounds of what it can do. Reveling in its impunity. And we can talk about how destabilising that is and the effect on the region, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, just before we do that, I mean, what do you think? Because Donald Trump in the US actually came out and condemned it. I mean, actually, Western leaders did say, they condemn this attack on the sovereignty of Qatar. I mean, you kind of think, a lot of people might find, even that surprising, given how much Western leaders have kowtowed to Israel. But I mean, Qatar's a key Western ally. It's kind of deranged. How low is the bar here? But what do you think about that? Do you believe what do you think about the US denials? Do you think the US was in the dark, or actually do you think that's just impossible? This is just it's a key. They've got their military base there. There's no and actually all this stuff that Donald Trump was, in terms of the so-called peace deal, ceasefire deal, being promoted, that actually this was just a ruse to get those Hamas leaders there so that Israel could wipe them out.
I mean, it's really hard to read, and of course, we're not behind the scenes, so we can only speculate. A guy you've had on many times, Paul Rogers, that great, military expert. I was reading something he wrote about this the other day. He basically said the idea that the Americans didn't know about it, because the story that's been put about is that the Americans had no idea this was happening, or they were told in the absolute last minute when it was too late to stop it and too late to warn Qatar. He said that suggestion is risible. And the reason he said it's risible is because not only did the US have that airbase in Qatar, you'd think the most important American airbase probably in the world would have the ability to see something like this coming. Not only do they have that, but he also pointed out, Paul Rogers, that they've got facilities all through the Middle East. Obviously, we all know that, but particularly in Israel and in Jordan, which are specifically capable of understanding what's going on in the airspace and specifically tasked with identifying threats, etc., to their allies. So you would expect, I'm not a military expert, I just defer to Paul Rogers and people like that on this sort of thing. You would expect that the minute the planes take off and it's clear where they're heading, the Americans know. And that's even if we accept what we're being told, which is that the Americans weren't told until the last minute. Even if they weren't told until the last minute, they would still be able to see for themselves, number one, and therefore, number two, stop it. But also, do we even buy that they were told at the last minute, really? I know this is the sort of thing that Benjamin Netanyahu would say, because he likes swaggering around and talking about how he's got the Americans wrapped around his finger. But at the end of the day, a state with a population of, 7 or 8 million does not boss around a superpower, especially not a superpower on which it is absolutely militarily dependent. I mean, I really just struggle to buy the idea that the Israelis didn't say, even if it wasn't that long before, that they didn't say to the Americans, look, this is what we're planning to do. And at that point, the Americans are obviously capable of just saying, well, no, you're not going to do that. You're out of your minds. And at which point the Israelis say, no, okay, we won't. Sorry, we mentioned it. But the Americans obviously said, okay, or we've heard you, something neutral. Clearly, the initiative for this comes from the Israelis, but at the end of the day, the Americans can stop it. Whenever they're told about it, the Americans can stop it. And if they don't stop it, maybe it's too strong to say it therefore becomes a US-Israeli airstrike. But the point is that with that effective de facto or explicit permission, the US is complicit in this. And that is the thing that is so galling for Qatar and all the other regional allies. We're supposed to be under an American security umbrella, and you've allowed one of your allies to hit us, and even given permission for it. So, yeah.
I mean, on that, look, it's one thing, and I'm not saying this in any way to downplay, obviously, these terrible Israeli crimes, but it's one thing to attack and invade Lebanon. It's one thing to keep invading Syria, which is obviously, was a state which was, ruled by, a regime most of the Arab world, all the other Arab regimes detested. But in any case, obviously overthrown after a ongoing horrible civil war. It's one thing to attack Iran again, no love lost there in terms of with the Arab world. But these are the conservative Gulf states, which, had kind of pride themselves on their idea of stability, on being, kind of this pact almost of, look, we're not going to rock the boat, and that will protect us from being attacked. But that's just been literally blown up, and it's humiliating, surely, utterly humiliating. But I mean, where does it leave those conservative Gulf states? Because in the case of Qatar, this is I'll come on to the Israeli rationale, but just on the surface of where does that leave them?
There's clearly a lot of disquiet from what I'm reading in the reporting, and you'd expect that. And you used the word humiliating. I think it's important to kind of dwell on that. Because, people around the region and the wider world are asking, where are the Arab states and all of this? Are they just going to sit and watch while Palestinians are, slaughtered, while they're liquidated as a nation? The question here becomes, are they even going to let themselves be bombed and just sit around and take it? Yeah, and, we're not in the heyday of Arab nationalism where states were really in danger of getting overthrown by a Nasser or something like that. But at the same time, we're only 15 years away from a wave of revolutions across the Arab majority world, which, yes, was about bread freedom and social justice, but it was also about a sense that these regimes don't represent us, they're collaborators. Protesters against Bashar al-Assad would call him a collaborator. A lot of it was about that. You're not representative, legitimate governments. You're in the pocket of, or you cower before US imperialism. And so these regimes are always quite sort of sensitive about this kind of thing. And it doesn't do them any favours whatsoever. And in terms of, so there's that, the threat from below, that the regimes would be worried about. Maybe Gulf states a little bit less, but some of them, Saudi, UAE in particular, Bahrain perhaps. And then there's the threat from outside, like the US, as I mentioned before. You're supposed to be our security umbrella. That's the whole point. And if you can't protect us, then we've got a problem, particularly when you're Qatar and your geostrategy is to do with a bunch of things, but amongst them is being a cultural hub, being a diplomatic hub, being a place where people can come. It's a safe place where you can conduct your diplomacy. If you can't guarantee people's security when you're trying to pitch yourself as playing that role, then you've got a real problem. And so the idea that the Israelis can integrate themselves into the rest of the region through ties with the Arab Gulf states, the US can broker these kind of deals as part of a wider settlement. You will remember that Biden and Blinken and all those guys pre-Trump, the diplomacy was all about not only will we have a ceasefire in Gaza, but it'll be part of a wider peace deal with the neighbouring regimes, especially Saudi. And then we can set down a sort of durable regional security architecture like that. Forget it. The Gulf states aren't going to be able politically to sign up to those deals, and they won't want to either. So, the implications are really, really significant.
In terms of Israel's rationale, which is that Qatar is harbouring Hamas and that they must reject them or Israel will. I mean, Qatar was pressured, wasn't it, to bring in Hamas officials for the good of peace and so on by Barack Obama back in 2012. And Benjamin Netanyahu had a relationship with Qatar, which came out after 7th October and called something of a controversy within Israel, which was based on money being transferred to pay for civil servants in Gaza. And the rationale was supposed to be, well, they wanted to keep it afloat because they wanted to keep the Palestinians divided between a Fatah-ruled West Bank and a Hamas-ruled Gaza, because then they could say we have no negotiating partner because Fatah doesn't rule the whole of Palestine and Hamas is illegitimate. That was so. Just explain what in terms of this rationale and that context, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's full of holes. The only reason Hamas are in Qatar in the way that they are is because the Americans told the Qataris to do it. And Israel has made use of that. That's been useful for Israel as well. I mean, we know how Israel characterises Hamas, but in practice, Hamas has been their neighbour for 20 years now, nearly. And they've had to deal with them in some way, either indirectly. And in terms of sort of propping up Hamas, I mean, yeah, it's about sort of divide and rule, and it's also sort of a more practical level. Perhaps you don't want total societal collapse in Gaza. The idea, I can't remember which Israeli official it was, but he said the idea is not to completely starve the Palestinians to death, but it's to put them on a diet. This is 20 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. And, just put the screws on them, but, put a floor under that as well. So allow some funding to go in. So, the funding of Hamas in Gaza by Qatar has those kind of twin objectives: divide the Palestinians, but ensure that, notwithstanding the blockade, Gaza society just about survives, just about. So yeah, it's disingenuous of Netanyahu to be like, oh wow, look, Hamas are in Qatar. How did that happen? Yeah. Got to stop. Who allowed that? So yeah, there are these inconsistencies. But I think what's really going on here potentially is that the Israelis just want to blow up the negotiations. It's not really about the fact that Hamas are in Qatar, which they already knew about. It's the fact that there are negotiations going on, and crucially, the negotiations were, I don't want to say they were going well, but Hamas was starting to change its position a little bit. The big sticking point in all these negotiations has been, on the one hand, Hamas's position has been, we want a phased return of the hostages in return for Israel, at the end, leaving Gaza. It's interim ceasefire and ultimately leaving Gaza. And that's how the thing plays out. And the Israeli position has always been, yeah, we can have a phased release of the hostages, but at the end of which we're going to destroy completely. And, that, so when people say, oh, Hamas could end it all by releasing the hostages, that was always false, because Netanyahu always said, I want total victory. So that was the kind of sticking point. Now, International Crisis Group, who are a really, really good kind of, think tank who produce excellent analysis, gave a little commentary about the way the diplomacy was going about early last week, before all this happened, obviously, before the strike on Qatar, where they said, look, the key development that's just happened sort of mid-August was that Hamas said, okay, we're not going to insist on an absolute permanent end to the conflict. And I think they understood that probably wasn't in the offing, but they wanted to do at least some diplomacy to get a bit of a breathing space. So they backed off of their sort of initial demands. And then, according to a crisis group, their sort of diplomatic position at the time, mid to late August into September, was not unlike an offer that they'd been brought by the Americans quite a few months earlier, which the Israelis indicated that they supported. So people can look up that article on International Crisis Group website and see what they make of it. But my take on this is that the Israelis are thinking this is a problem. Hamas are coming to a diplomatic sort of position it's going to be hard for us to say no to. And at the same time as that's happening, there's all this additional pressure coming from Europe. Trump wants an end to this because he's got this, this weird crusade he's on about getting the Nobel Peace Prize, which is obviously rooted in his resentment towards Barack Obama. We don't need to get into the psychology of that. But long story short, there's all this pressure on the Israelis to end this. And Hamas becoming more close to the Israeli position is a problem for them because they don't want peace. They want total victory, and they don't care about the hostages. There's pressure coming domestically as well. If Hamas moderates his position, the internal opposition in Israel is going to say to Netanyahu, this is an opportunity to get our family members and our loved ones back. He doesn't want that either. He wants to push on to total victory. He wants, the maximum land, minimum Palestinians. This is a massive opportunity, and we're not going to lose that just to get some hostages back. We're not going to lose that just to have, a bit of peace. We're actually in this war, as far as we're concerned, we're winning. So I think that's what this is about. I certainly don't think it's a response to the attack in Jerusalem a few days ago, supposedly apparently from Hamas. And I don't think it's got anything to do with, we're just going to take out Hamas figures anywhere, because they've been there for 2 years. Why now? Why in this moment? I think it's that. I think it's blow up these negotiations. We don't want negotiations. We don't want a ceasefire. We don't even want peace. We want victory. Total victory over Hamas and over the Palestinian people as well. I think that's what this is about.
Well, exactly. I mean, they've just decided they want rid of the Palestinian people. And in Gaza, that's sped up. In the West Bank, I've just come back from the West Bank. That's, happening in a more drawn out process, but the vice is, every day becomes tighter on the Palestinian people within the West Bank. And if you look at, the polling of Jewish Israelis, most of them want the Palestinian citizens of Israel to be removed.
Yeah.
In terms of how this impacts US power, I would argue, I'm writing a book called The Fall of the West. I declare an interest. But I would describe, the US is, I would say, the 21st century, it's a hegemon in free fall. Myself, I didn't just hear your thought on that. But I mean, in terms of, how this, because some would go, well, this is strength. Look at them; they can do what they want, and the US is backing them up. They've got impunity. But I mean, what do you actually think the impact on US power of this behaviour is?
I mean, I'm interested. If you're writing this book and you're thinking through these things, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. My take on this would be, we could delineate. We can sort of separate out between Israel on the one hand and the US on the other. With Israel, some people say that Israel is acting in a counterproductive way. I'm in two minds about that. I think the rationale Israel will have is, we're doing all this stuff with impunity. Facts on the ground are a real thing. If we end up in control of the entire territory between the river and the sea, who's going to throw us out of it? They will be thinking, that's how the United States of America was created. That's how Australia was created. That's how Canada was created. That could be their rationale. I'm not saying that's correct. I'm saying that could be their rationale. We can use this opportunity to create the greater Israel that we want. And at the end of it, we're going to be secure in that. That could be their rationale. So anyway, that's debatable. But for the US, I don't think it is debatable. I think this is just bad for the US. At one level, I suspect people like Joe Biden, for example, were thinking, number one, an ally of ours has been attacked. We have to show that when an ally, the United States, is attacked, there is a price to pay. And that's a classic imperial rationale. We don't have credibility unless our adversaries, when they raise their heads, are absolutely pummeled. So when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades Kuwait, there has to be a punishment beating for that. The entire Iraqi army has to be destroyed, all that kind of thing. And they also see an opportunity to really see a lot of damage caused, not even by them, but by their proxy. They could just provide the arms, be the quartermaster, be the diplomatic sort of supporter of all of that. Israel does the work of destroying American adversaries in the Middle East. And look at what they've, quote unquote, achieved. Hassan Nasrallah is dead. Hezbollah is decimated. Iran, regime is still there, and they can probably still create nuclear weapons. But it's a punishment beating nonetheless. It's a humiliation nonetheless. So Israel, the Americans may think, okay, Israel's able to do all these things for us. We're stronger in the region because of this. I don't think that's correct. I mean, whether or not it's correct, it's monstrous, but I don't think it's correct either for two reasons. Number one, you can't rule this region by force because, there are people there who aren't going to accept it. And you've tried ruling this region by force for a long time, and it's not been, it's not been stable, it's not been sustainable. And the other thing is that empires historically, and let alone the sort of near imperial powers that we have today, they don't rule by force alone, either in places like the Middle East or more generally. They do need a degree of consent and acquiescence. They need, for example, ruling classes, wider political classes in Europe, to take one example, and the population of Europe, to at least a degree. Not everyone's going to be on board of US power in the world, but you need a decent amount of people to say, look, the US is fundamentally a force for good in the world. They stand for, international stability, liberal values, human rights, blah, blah, blah. You need people to believe that stuff. You need them to genuinely believe it. And you and I were both politically aware and active during the war on terror, and we saw what that did to the US's reputation. But I think this episode in Gaza is so just dark. I mean, the war on terror was utterly immoral. The aggression against Iran.
This is a different scale.
Abu Ghraib, utterly, but this is evil. I mean, I don't like using the word generally. But I feel like we had to get more comfortable with using the word evil because
I agree. I've gone on a journey there. I agree.
And this is so. Just to wrap up this thought, this is the problem. I think for the US. I mean, any sort of left-wing Marxist post-colonial theorization of how American power works has said that, look, the key components are like capital, the economic side, state power, the military side, but also the ideological side. There's a racial element of that. We're the white Westerners with our advanced values and stuff like that. And there's also the more sort of philosophical, political side, like it's all intertwined. We believe in liberal values and democracy, et cetera, and the rule of law, and and they just laid waste to all of that. And that stuff is not window dressing. It's really, really important.
No, I don't want to just keep giving away my book, but that is obviously a big part of what I've been writing about, and I think it's because you got the European colonizers who used as justification because they had a kind of here's our benevolent justification for stealing resources and conquering people, which was we're spreading civilization and uplifting people. They're childlike, often brutal childlike people, and they would use either invented or real violence to justify infinitely worse violence, but to portray them as backward savages and all the rest of it. But that was their, it's not like they we're stealing their resources. They had a benevolent claim. I mean, King Leopold, of all, depraved, probably about 10 million people in Congo killed by him. He claimed he was waging an anti-slavery campaign. They all, Mussolini, when he invaded Abyssinia, claimed he was liberating Abyssinia from slavery. But the Americans their one were in the words of Reagan and Kennedy, we're the city on the hill. We only want for others, as George W. Bush said, what we have for ourselves. We're here to spread freedom, democracy. And what's interesting is Donald Trump is the first president since I don't know what the 20s isolationist Republicans said, but to not have a moral claim, because Woodrow Wilson did. After World War I, Roosevelt obviously did, Kennedy did, obviously, Reagan did, Eisenhower back did, Reagan very much did, and the neocons did. Whatever contempt we had, they were, they're almost like, we're going to have a pro-democracy, pro-American revolution across the world. But the reason I don't buy the indigenous in America as well, because I'm just interested. I do that gets repeated a lot, and I've had, this has come up when I've interviewed people. I guess the reason you're right that Israel, in my view, well, I don't normally do this in this interview. You did ask my opinion. They are absolutely trying to, the facts on the ground. You do as much as you can, and they're in a rush for a reason because they think they're going to lose Western support. Public opinion shifting dramatically in the West. So what you do is you do as much as quickly as you can,
and
then say facts on the ground, and then there'll be sad films about the Palestinians and all the rest of it. What can you do about it? The reason I don't buy it is about 90 to 95% of the indigenous Americas were wiped out by disease. I mean, decimated that population in a way which then made it obviously much easier to subjugate through horrible genocidal violence. You didn't have a kind of coherent, unifying nationhood because you had hundreds of different tribes, nations. It wasn't, like you had this coherent, here's the nation of indigenous Americans, which is obviously divide and rule, divide and conquer. Obviously, we know the history of that, and you could therefore as well at the same time massively outnumber a decimated population with a kind of like, you've got Europe over there with a limitless. Well, not limitless, but vast numbers of people coming from particularly Europe. Whereas, between the river and the sea, the population between, people who are Jewish or Palestinian is about 50-50. And they have a coherent, national nationhood. And as we know, given, the claims of Zionism are about people being expelled over 2 millennia ago, and I'm not going to get bogged down into the historical facts about, who can claim that actually they are indigenous to the land there, given how many people who are Palestinians are actually people who are Jewish who converted to Christianity or Islam, or both, actually, as it turns out, whilst others are Jewish Israelis are people who are people who converted in Europe after that, hundreds of years after that. Anyway, whatever. But do you know what I mean? I just think that whatever happens, even if they expelled all Palestinians from historical Palestine, would that mean that's the end of Palestinian cause? I don't think so. And, the Crusader Kingdom, the longest Crusader Kingdom lasted about 150 years. Different, I know, because that's not nations. Nations are a very modern phenomenon. Anyway, that was my thoughts on that. Just, I want to lastly ask about our beloved government. Who really are just a catastrophe. I mean, it's like, you don't want to say I told you so, but...
I do, actually. I'd like to say I told everyone so. Just as a little digression, can I just say, I wrote an article for Novara in something like June 2020, and this is the only time I ever got ratioed on social media. So I'm particularly, I don't want to relish in saying I told you so, because I would have preferred if they'd been good. I'd have preferred if, if those pledges he had, in the leadership election in 2020 were honoured. That would have been great. I wrote something in the sort of mid-2020 saying that this guy's a disaster and, we as a left need to start challenging him. And I just got ratioed into the sun by every centrist and soft left person going, saying, how can you believe this guy? He is awful. They are awful. They don't know what they're doing. They were never going to create a sustainable kind of centre-left project in this country.
Can I quote someone else from June 2020?
Someone beginning with O and ending with Wyn Jones, perhaps.
No, it actually isn't. No, very much not. Oh, my word. No, Glenn O'Hara, Blairite, he's one of these political science people. And the political science in Britain just seems to be full of like aggressive centrists. But whatever. Starmer can chair a meeting. He can draft a minute. He can lead a team. He can hold a press conference. He can stay calm in an interview. Those skills look simple, but they're not, and they're vital. It's funny because, competence was supposed to be the big thing, and it's not like they just don't have vision. They're sort of just a mess. But anyway, go on, sorry. Because I'm interested in terms of Gaza and the impact of this on the government and Britain, given
this really speaks to the pathologies of this like New Labour 2.0, the inferior later iteration of, of something we've seen before. And in both iterations, it seems to me, of New Labour, the key characteristics has been kiss up, kick down. Where is power, and how quickly can we crawl up power's backside? Mm-hmm. And it's an inherently conformist project. It always was, and it's got a sense also of respect for power. That's what makes us sensible people who are worthy of respect. the extent to which we align with power and align with conventional wisdom. And, people who believe in anything else are, to use Starmer's words the other day, engaging in student politics. It's that kind of respectful authority and contempt for anyone who challenges it that's absolutely inherent to them. Now, how does that translate? This translates into Gaza very, very directly. Their view is the US runs the show, and that's that. And because the US runs the show, and this was true in the 2000s with Blair and Bush, and it's true now with Starmer and Biden, and even Starmer and the fascist Trump, these guys run the show. The strategic kind of, non-negotiable of British foreign relations since the end of empire is we are the lieutenants of the United States. The Americans want to back the Israelis, therefore we back the Israelis. There's lots of talk amongst various people on this issue where they say, the British are in fault of the Israelis or whatever. Yeah. It's not that at all. It's not that at all. It's the US. It's that subservience. And, that has been at the heart of everything over the last couple of years. They simply don't want to step too far outside of the Americans' position. And when they've had to manage the domestic issue, the marches and the general pressure and the general revulsion amongst the population, and even within the political class for what's happening, they've responded with gesture politics, tinkering, nothing too substantive because that would involve breaking from Washington. So their deference to power has led them to end up being complicit in the genocide. And one of the sort of ironies of this is, and you'll remember this from 20 years ago, they used to call us appeasers. Those of us who opposed the invasion of Iraq, they used to call us appeasers. They used to say, you're the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain, whereas we want to take on, the fascists of the modern age. What are they doing now, if not appeasing fascism? I mean, I've been calling them Vichy Labour. I think that's what they are. They're, whether it's at home with Farage or whether it's abroad with Trump. And here we are with the Labour Party in one of its darkest moments, I think, being complicit in a genocide and rolling out the red carpet for the far right at home. It's horrible stuff, but it speaks to the nature of New Labour, I think, and it speaks to the nature of the Starmer project in particular. And it's not going to change because this really is who they are. This is deeply embedded in the culture of the project and the culture of the factions that people want that to change. Going to have to get rid of these guys. There's no other way, to address it, unfortunately.
Amen to that. Dave, that was a real tour de force. I think we covered ample ground, huge amounts of ground. Always so compelling, so knowledgeable. You know your stuff. That's the way it is. If people don't like it, they can suck it up, frankly, Dave.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
But no, seriously, you're you are a fountain of knowledge, and we are very lucky to have you. One of the best experts in international relations we have. So everyone, do show your appreciation. Leave lovely comments praising him. And yeah, if you don't like it, leave. If you don't know, I don't know why I said that. I don't know what's wrong with me. Just abuse me instead if you're unhappy. Use me as your punching bag. But like and subscribe. As ever, share the video. But cheers, buddy. Really appreciate it.
No problem, mate. Thanks very much. Thank you.